up. And we are now recording, and that language is posted in the chat box. So, okay. Thanks everyone for joining us again today. Just wanted to do a quick overview of the learning to date that you would have covered with Robin. You all kind of did the AmeriCorps 101 and program and fiscal orientation. There was a webinar that talked about locating, reviewing, and reading AmeriCorps guidance. And then last month, Lou joined us to do theory of change, logic models, and performance measures / data. And then on the docket for today, we're going to do kind of the introduction to the AmeriCorps NOFO and the Serve Washington RFGA, diving into narratives, ongoing grant development, and other general requirements. We're also going to be talking about partnerships with host sites or other partners. So that's what we've done, what we're doing, and then where we're going is in November. That's when we get to tackle my favorite part, which is the member and site development series. So we get to kick off a fun quarter in November, but let's go ahead and wrap up Q1. So this list of questions should be kind of familiar. These are the questions for you all to be considering as we go through this Q1. And the questions that we're adding on today for you are, will you have host sites? And what other partners are necessary for your program to be successful? And how will you obtain the cash match necessary to operate the program? Okay, so I believe Robin kind of introduced this at the orientation, but I really wanted to just revisit it again. There's also a PDF of this on the Planning Grant webpage under the orientation, and it's called Operational Grant Opportunities. But first, let's cover some of these definitions and some of our alphabet soup with the with our acronyms. The first one is NOFO, and that is the Notice of Funding Opportunity. So that's the AmeriCorps request for grant applications at that federal level. Then the RFGA is the request for grant application, and that's what we at the Serve Washington level do. And it's the request for applicants within Washington state. Then we have two pools of funding. We run two different grant making cycles. The competitive program, or the competitive grant pool, is for our larger programs that have a really strong evidence, that are asking for big pots of money. And with this one, competitive applicants go head to head in competition with other grants from all over the country. AmeriCorps has roughly $300 million that they grant out, but these are the larger programs. The formula pool, which is where we would probably suggest you all start, is for smaller programs, new programs that still have a lot of, figuring out what the program really looks like once you get that implemented. It's also programs that are really starting to build evidence and are smaller, asking for smaller amounts of money. Washington gets roughly $4 million to grant out in our formula process. And in this competition, you are going up against other grants within Washington State, and it's reviewed and awarded by our governor appointed commission. I see a question about talking about what it means in terms of small versus large agencies. You know, really more than the agency size, it's the program size. So we have programs as small as 15 MSY, and that would definitely be in formula. And then our biggest program is at 450 MSYs, and that's definitely at our competitive. That is our largest program. And since our funding is more limited in formula, that's why we want to push those bigger ones. Yeah, a question about MSY. That is member service year. And I will get to that a little bit later in our webinar today. So those are kind of the two pools. Occasionally, there will be opportunities for special initiatives. At the same time that the competitive grant cycle is running right now, so that bottom section, we've got this competitive competition running in the fall. It is for fiscal year 23, which means members would start in summer or fall of 2023 and serve through 2024. And these are the materials that we're going to be using as an example today, is things from our competitive pool. Like I said, we wouldn't encourage most of you to apply in the spring for that formula competition, except when there might be opportunities for special initiatives. And right now there is one for public health AmeriCorps. So there's kind of a separate pot of money from the CDC for that. And actually we would encourage Valley View to think about participating in the public health AmeriCorps, because it is a special initiative and a special pot of funds. So that's kind of what the grant opportunities cover. And most years will look like this. And these grant opportunities use a combination of the AmeriCorps Federal NOFO and the Serve Washington RFGA. So today we're going to be looking at the fall 2022, which is for fiscal year 2023. We're going to be looking at that RFGA just as an example of what this process and timeline looks like. This competition opened in Washington on September 14th. Then we always do a TTA session, that's training and technical assistance. And that technical assistance is around AmeriCorps. We're not here to answer IT questions. So it's technical AmeriCorps technical assistance. And then applications for this competitive process are going to be due October 19th. And if you're interested in learning more, the link to that is on this slide, and you can also find it on our website. Okay, so I tend to be a visual learner and appreciate flow charts. So this is the general flow of the RFGA process. And it doesn't matter if you're applying competitively or formula, this is the general flow. It starts with you submit your grant in eGrants, and then our governor appointed commission will review that and vote on applications. Then for those selected, Serve Washington will do a clarification period. You know, if there's an issue that we find in your budget, or the theory of change isn't totally fleshed out, we'll come and we'll ask questions at that time to get some clarification. Those applications then get submitted to AmeriCorps, the agency, who then reviews and goes through another clarification period for those selected. Then awards are made and you get an AmeriCorps member to help your organization and community. And that's the operational grant. So this flow for the fall competitive process takes about 8 to 9 months. And the spring formula process is about 4 to 5 months. So it's one of those where there's a flurry of activity, you need to do it, get it done, and then you need to wait for feedback or wait to hear. So both will have periods of wait time. Now, before you get to that point where you're submitting an eGrants, there's a lot of work to do to get that application all together. So this is just kind of a general overview of what to look at. You know, I always joke that the only thing that has more paperwork than a federal program is a federal program run through a state agency. So there is a lot because we need to make sure we're hitting all the rules, the regulations, requirements for both the federal grant making and the state contracting. So it's a lot. However, we're here to help walk everyone through this and try to make it as easy as possible. So our RFGA is the basic overview of the grant application. That's where the state requirements and the Washington specific priorities are. That's also the important dates and timeline and goes over the application review process. The AmeriCorps federal NOFO is where they set the federal priority areas. This is where you have thresholds such as the cost per member service year. And MSY is kind of like an FTE in the employer world. And there's a maximum amount that you can request per MSY. The AmeriCorps NOFO is also where living allowances and those required rates live. And then it also goes over application components and requirements, such as narrative, logic model, and additional documents. There may be some dates in that AmeriCorps NOFO around reporting. Those dates are actually for Serve Washington. We're considered a prime grantee, and you all would be, should you get operational grants, you all would be our sub-grantees. So that's why the dates, important dates and timeline that our program should follow are in the RFGA, and disregard anything date-wise in the NOFO. In addition to those two documents, there's another one that is application instructions. This one has the details on how to actually submit the grant and in eGrants, and instructions on doing your budget. Then the two final documents that need to be reviewed with the RFGA process are the AmeriCorps supplemental information, which is where all the definitions to all of these things can be found, and performance measure instructions. We kind of talked about performance measures. Well, not kind of. Lou did cover performance measures in the previous call. And today, what we're really going to be diving into is the narratives and the budget section. So then for the application narratives, this is where the bulk of your pages and the bulk of the application is within this narrative section. And there are different sections within the narratives that you are going to be asked to address. But we want you to look at the weight of these questions. So for example, the theory of change, logic model, and that evidence base, that's worth 44% of the overall score of an application. And that's why we dedicate a whole webinar to these topics and assign some of your homework in this area, because this is such a big part of the application scoring. Now, the budget, cost effectiveness and budget is worth 25%. And we'll talk about that a little bit more today, but also throughout our year together. It's important to be always revisiting the budget as new learning occurs, because that budget is that guiding document. And hopefully you'll be learning something in the next couple of quarters that might make you adjust your budget. Then member experience and member supervision. We're gonna preview that criteria today, but we won't really get into member development until next quarter. And then also there's the organization and background. So that's your organizational experience and staffing and management structure and cultural responsiveness, all that. We want to know about your organization, and are you ready to take on an AmeriCorps grant and support that? The accountability and compliance section is where prohibited activities is addressed. It's also where grant applications should address how to hold host sites accountable, how to do the training and hold them accountable. Ultimately, it's your grant. So if something wonky happens at a host site, it's your responsibility to make sure that you're training your host sites and have monitoring to be able to hold them accountable and catch that. So each of these sections will have an associated list of criteria. So for example, looking at the member section, it's worth 6 points, but the RFGA is going to ask you to address all of these different criteria. So in order to receive points, the application reviewer, the reader, must feel like all of these points are addressed. So what is the AmeriCorps members' service look like? How will it provide them opportunities to develop as leaders? How will they gain skills? What types of additional benefits are they receiving? What's the demographic of the community served, and plans to recruit AmeriCorps members from the geographic or demographic communities in which the program operates? How will your organization ensure the project engages a diverse and inclusive group of members? And then what is your Do you have a DEI, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Council, or similar mechanism that seeks diversity in staff and board? So it might be easy to just simply regurgitate and say, the AmeriCorps member will gain skills, or AmeriCorps member will be a leader. But you'll need to be specific. What are the skills? What type of leader? What type of training, etc. So really give specifics that address these criteria. Oops, I think I went too far. Yeah, okay. So an example is AmeriCorps members will receive sufficient guidance and support from their supervisor to provide effective service. But I would ask, how? What does that mean? How are you going to do that? Or AmeriCorps supervisors will be adequately trained and prepared to follow AmeriCorps program regulations, priorities, and expectations. Again, what does that look like and how? So pay attention to the point values in combination with page limits and dedicate your time and space accordingly. So you wouldn't want to spend half of your page limits on member section when these two sections are a total of 10% of the application, right? You want to make the different grading percentages, scoring percentages match the page limits. And with this one, you might be wondering why there isn't more points awarded or more weight given to the members and the member section. Well, this used to be a big part of it, but over the years, AmeriCorps, the agency, has kind of removed some of those narratives on member training, development, branding, that type of thing, because the responses were too similar and did not really differentiate the applications from one another. And so they want to focus more time on those things that differentiate the applications. And having said that, AmeriCorps, the agency, and Serve Washington really strongly believe member development, member experience, and we keep these topics prominent in our training and monitoring, and we'll focus a lot of upcoming webinars on the overall member experience because we do find so much value and importance in that. So even though it's not worth that many points, it should be given a lot of consideration when you're designing your program. Okay. Pausing there to take a breath and get some tea. What kind of questions does everybody have? And what about a temperature check? On a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being completely lost, 5 being absolutely got it, where is everybody feeling? Cautiously a 3, I like that, 3.5. Okay.
Jenny, this is Beth.
Hi.
So, hi, good morning. I have a quick question because we're so new at even setting up the program that we're not sure. I mean, we think this is an excellent idea. However, we don't know because we're just still in the process of hiring a program manager and things like that. So with the deadline being so near, I guess just kind of support and guidance for where we are in space and time, I guess. Does that make sense? Sorry, I know we're being recorded and that was not clear, but.
No, I totally followed you on that. And I do think that with you all considering applying now, ideally, we would be doing the planning grant and you would have most of a year to really think about this and figure some things out. But with the Public Health AmeriCorps special initiative and special grant cycle, yeah, I 100% hear you on that. And let's have a meeting with you all and me and Micaiah offline to really dig into some of those questions. Yeah, and do some additional technical assistance offline for that one.
Excellent, thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the other Beth says, it all makes sense, but worried that you're missing something. You know, that is bound to happen. These are big and complicated and things get missed. Or you think you got it. Even today, Robin always did the Zoom. So as I was setting up today, I had to call our other Zoom person and say, Robin showed me how to do this, but now that I'm actually doing it, I forgot. So that happens, you know, we're talking about an RFGA process that might not happen for another several months for some of you. That's totally understandable. And that's what we're here for. We really see this time as a way to help support you in making the decision if AmeriCorps is right for you and laying some foundation work. And that first 3-year grant cycle is where there's going to be a lot of kind of hands-on learning, right? Sometimes you don't know what's going to work and what's not going to work until you actually flush it out. So. And Lisa, I see your hand up.
Hi, sorry for the extraneous noise. So we're in the same position as the previous ones in that we're still in that hiring mode.
Yeah.
And so are cautiously looking at deadlines and timelines and want to confirm, is it possible to not apply for this deadline that's coming up at the beginning of the year, but delay it to the next one to make sure that we're ready?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, even if a planning grant goes through the whole thing and decides, oh, AmeriCorps is not right for me, we see that as successful because we'd rather you figure that out in the planning grant stage than, you know, when you have members. We also are right now having conversations with an organization to apply this year, and they were a planning grant 2 whole years ago. So absolutely, whatever timeline works for you for our grant cycles, jump in whenever it works. And I will say that I think all 3 of our planning grants are in that process of hiring the kind of the main contact for Serve Washington, the main person to do this work. And so none of you should feel like you're behind the ball because you're right there. We have these recorded. Once your new staff person gets on, they can review those. And later today, I do apologize that I haven't set up individual calls with each of you yet. And later today, I'm going to circle back and get those. So in addition to these monthly webinars, we will have monthly check-in calls one-on-one and provide really individualized support. So yeah, this is a lot. Please don't feel like you're lost. Please don't feel like you're behind the ball because it is a lot. I validate that. and really dedicated to helping everybody figure it out.
Thank you.
Ah, absolutely. Okay. All right. Now, the favorite part, application budget. So the budget instructions can be found in the AmeriCorps application instructions. And we do have an Excel budget tool that is provided to work outside of eGrants. eGrants is not always the easiest to use. It's not the hardest system I've ever had to use, but it's also not the easiest. Especially with the budget, we really suggest that you utilize the Excel tool to craft your budget and then plug it into eGrants after you are able to, have Excel do all the formulas and things for you. So then there are two budget types, and they're fiscal agreements and ways to approach the type of budget that you do in your grants with us. The first one is cost reimbursements. All planning grants are cost reimbursement, so you should know kind of what this looks like. And most planning grants are required to apply under this financial agreement for the first operational grant, unless already established as a fixed amount subgrantee. So if we have a planning grant that is part of a national direct program, then they can go fixed, but we would really want everybody to start out as a cost reimbursable. So I'm not going to talk too much about fixed. It's essentially straightforward. Oops, sorry. So the cost reimbursable is a detailed line item budget where you tell us this is what we're going to be using the money for. And then when you bill us, you say, we used this money for this, so give us the money to cover that, right? And the reimbursement is based on those actual expenditures. Also with cost reimbursement, you will be required to match it and to report that match. The fixed amount, that's for our long-standing grantees. The budget is based on those member service years, not on actual expenditures. There's no match requirement, but that reimbursement is really tied to member enrollment and member hours. It may look attractive to go fixed because of the less reporting requirements. But as always, there's two sides to most things, and we would want you to build up to being a fixed amount grant, because even though it's got some additional autonomy, it also requires high levels of enrollment and retention to draw down those funds. Oh, and Beth, I love that question. She asked about cash match requirements, and that's what we're talking about now. So for cost reimbursement budgets, there is a match requirement that can be cash or a combination of cash and in kind. So the minimum grantee share is at 24% for the first 3 years. And then it starts to gradually increase beginning in year 4 up to 26, year 5 is 30. And then by the 10th year of funding, if awarded, grantees are paying 50%, are not paying, matching the grant at 50%, a dollar for dollar. I really want to note here that the actual cash match needed may be higher and is really highly dependent on the program design. These AmeriCorps grants are really designed to be a public-private partnership. It's supposed to be the feds helping community organizations with the capacity building of AmeriCorps. It's not meant to cover the full extent of the program or the full cost of the program. So not intended to be solely funded by federal government. And that's why we have this cash match requirement. But even in your first year or first 3 years of a grant cycle, when it's at 24%, you are going to need to gradually increase that. So keep thinking about that, because we don't want, when you increase to 26%, that to come as a surprise or be incredibly challenging for your budgeting. So for cost reimbursed budgets, there is the federal share. And for fiscal year 23, the maximum federal share is at $23,000 per member service year. So the MSY is equal to 1 full-time AmeriCorps member, which is like an FTE, and the full-time AmeriCorps member is 1,700 hours. So then if you are using less than full-time members, you'll really need to pay attention to the actual MSY. The example here is 20 full-time members is 20 MSY, and doing the math with that 23,000 cost per MSY, that would be an award maximum of 460,000. If you still have 20 members, but they're half-time members in a 900-hour position, those members are actually 0.5 MSY. And so for the same number of bodies, the same number of members is actually 10 MSY instead of 20. And that means the maximum grant you could request is 230,000. The federal share can be competitive, so only ask for the maximum if necessary. And having said that, a lot of new programs are often funded at the maximum cost per MSY. So be thoughtful about how much you are going to ask for. And again, that would be really good conversations to have on an individual program level with us. Then required member costs. For 2023, the living allowance for a full-time member, there's a range, and it's between $17,600 and $35,200. So if you look at that, if the maximum living allowance is $35,000, but the maximum federal share is $23,000 per MSY, like, the federal share is not going to cover the operating costs. It might not even cover full member costs depending on your program design. So really, the money should not be the driver for your program design. The community need should drive what those members are, if they're full-time or less than full-time. We do hear from successful AmeriCorps programs that per member, one MSY, one full-time, it's often like between 30 and 40,000 for total operating costs in order to support that member and that program. So that means you do need to have substantial cash match in order to run these programs. That federal share does vary based on the different grant opportunities, but really, again, the big takeaway messages from this slide, let program design dictate what type of member slots you have, not money, and be prepared to have that partnership, that public-private partnership, and invest some cash match into this. There is a question. These grants cover members, but what if we have a program manager we're paying for through the planning grant? Is part of their salary also allowable? Yes, absolutely. We look at the budget for operational grants and see how many FTE is dedicated, I'm switching between MSY and FTE, sorry. How much of a staff person's time is dedicated to coordinating and directing these programs. So definitely program manager time is allowable.
So just to follow up on my question with that, so if the maximum grant is 460,000, but part of it was going to pay our program manager and not necessarily out of our match, like say we were using all our match for benefits for the members or for another program expense, would we need to budget for fewer members to make sure we're including the salary of the program manager? Or is that just the max amount of money we can ask for members, and then we can ask for part of the program manager's salary on top of that, and then our 24% is just included?
No, that would be the max for the whole budget. And then you could, or not the whole budget, excuse me, the whole grant request. So if you have 20 MSYs, you can request that 460,000. But then from there, if you're taking that 460,000 and the cash and in-kind match from your agency to come up with that budget total, you get to do with that money what you want, as long as it meets the requirements, allowable, reasonable, allocable, I think is the third one. So you get to figure that out.
Okay, but the maximum grant amount is 460,000. Okay, great. Just trying to wrap my head around all that. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. All right, then to talk about the living allowance a little bit more for those members. The living allowance is not a wage. Members are not paid hourly, they're not salary, they don't earn a wage. It truly is a living allowance. Sometimes you'll also hear the term stipend, a member stipend. However, even though it is not a wage and not paid hourly, you can base the living allowance on a livable wage. You've got that max living allowance, but you can go up to the max if you've got the budget for it. You can do that. You can base the living allowance on similar minimum wage and minimum hourly rates. It just can't be considered a wage or a salary. Also, the pay continues uninterrupted while in service and not tied to numbers of hours or leave time. So, if you're paying members $1,000 a paycheck, and the member goes on vacation or gets sick and is only there for 3 days out of a pay period, you still pay them $1,000, right? However, one of the areas that you can do is you can develop policies on prorating pay periods when the service ends or begins in the middle of a pay period. Or if there's a 0-hour pay period, if a member goes on vacation for 2 weeks and doesn't serve for that whole pay period, you can set a policy about not paying them for that 0-hour pay period. This living allowance is intended to support individuals in meeting their basic needs during service. So you may want to consider what the cost of living is for your area when determining that living allowance. The RFGA is where you can find, it's in the NOFO, but it's also going to be in the RFGA because it's an important number, what the minimum and maximum living allowances are. And you get to make the determination within that range of the federal allowance, what you are going to pay your members in living allowance.
Jenny, this is Beth.
Yeah.
Regarding the previous slide. So how do, or sorry, Beth Cumberland, how do you have data for how people have made the decision of whether they have 0-hour pay periods and what the rationale was for that?
Yeah, totally. I was going to
because that's excellent. Thank you.
Yeah. So let me repeat the question just to make sure that I heard it right. The question is if we have examples of policies of when programs would do a 0-hour pay period.
Correct. And the rationale of how they made that decision.
Yes, we do.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yep. A lot of the things that we do might not necessarily be on hand, but we can very easily go to the programs that we know have these policies and ask them to share it. So if that's a question, I can definitely get that for you.
Yes, please, and thank you.
Yeah. And then another question about best practices, what works and how do we make, and what would best recruit around whatever decision we make. So this is just a snapshot of where living allowances are. In PY20, the range was between 14,000 and 26,000, with the average being about 16,000. We have seen a big jump in recent years. Recruitment has been hard, and there's been this collective societal consciousness raising around fair wages and equity and what is equitable. And a lot of our programs are really discovering that the living allowance, only paying the minimum of the living allowance, which is what our programs did for several years, most of our programs. But they're finding that that doesn't align with their organizational values around equity. So we saw a big jump between program year 20 and program year 21. And then I still haven't pulled all of the data for 2022, but we've seen another big jump in that. So you absolutely can pay that minimum, but regarding that question around best practice, having a higher living allowance really does make an impact on recruitment, on retention, and on member experience. So yeah, it's a lot to think about, especially when you start looking at the budget and trying to figure out how all of that is going to work out. But yeah, that's a fun thing you all get to tackle. So then, speaking about budget, as you all are preparing your budget, you'll want to make sure that you're defining your amounts for really particular use. So don't put in there things like miscellaneous or contingent amounts. You'll want to itemize each cost and present the basis for all the calculations in the form of an equation. So the budget template, that Excel document I referenced earlier, it's going to have a space for narrative equations and the final amount. So here we see the example of, you know, 45,000 for a program director, and then the rationale behind that would be 90% of a $50,000 salary. Or for our required annual meeting, instead of just putting $2,470, you would put that, but then in the narrative section say, to staff times airfare plus ground transportation for how many days times lodging and per diem. So you would show how you got that calculation for the 2,470. There's also unallowable expenses that are kind of listed in that 2 CFR Part 200. So like money for entertainment, you can't put that in your budget. That is not necessary, it's not reasonable, and it's not allowable. Although you can argue that, I would argue it, but the federal government sees it that way. And we can't really argue with the federal government that much. Also, in your doing your budgets, don't use cents, round it up to the biggest number. And then, like I said, the budgets must comply with the federal laws, regulations, and requirements of 2 CFR Part 200. So I see another question in the chat box going back to the slide about living allowance. Was that the medium allowance for Washington State or for the whole country? That is just Washington State. That is just our portfolio here in Washington. And there are great variations across the country in what this looks like, but this is for Washington State.
That's what I was thinking, because living costs in Seattle, for example, are bonkers. But yeah, I just wanted to make sure I was wrapping my head around it realistically.
Yeah, absolutely. Wait. Sorry. I keep hitting buttons and going too far forward. Okay, so within the application budget, that budget is broken down into 3 sections. Section 1 is program costs, so personnel expenses, fringe benefits, travel, supplies and equipment. If you're going to contract with anybody, it's listed in Section 1. Training, evaluation, and other costs that you can define. Those are all in Section 1. This should kind of look familiar as planning grants, since you had to do a budget, but there are added sections to be used for operational grants, like Section 2 member costs. Section 3, I'm going to jump back up to Section 2 in just a second. but section 3 is about the indirect cost, and you all will choose just one. If you're using the AmeriCorps fixed rate, the indirect cost rate, or the de minimis rate. Then jumping back up to member costs, the law states the requirements are that you only need to provide a living allowance and health care for full-time members. However, we say that with a great deal of caution because, you know, is it more attractive to financially use a part-time model and not incur living allowance and healthcare costs? Yeah, absolutely. But there's a lot of other things to consider, such as attracting people to serve. That recruitment piece is really hard if they're not getting those benefits. And providing those benefits consistently and fairly, and in a way that's ethical and equitable. And with this, your program design should be the driver of if your model is full-time or less than full-time. It should not be the budget. And if you do land that your program design is better with less than full-time, a 1,200-hour member or a 900-hour member, really consider what member benefits you will provide. So that living allowance and healthcare might not be required for everybody. Full-time, yes. And then if you are paying living allowance, you're required to do FICA and workers' comp. When I send out the recording or the notification that the recording's done, I'm also going to send out that template that I've referenced a couple times, and it includes descriptions of each of these things. So if you've got additional questions, take a look at that. And then happy to have Thomas join us on one of our monthly calls to help clarify any questions that you might have around that. All right, another place to pause for questions. Although I really appreciate y'all asking questions as we go. It's a lot nicer to have more of a conversation than just me talking at you the whole time. Okay.
No, not at this time. Thank you.
Huh? Sorry, I missed that.
Oh, I was just saying, no, thank you. We've been answering them as we go, so thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So talked about budgets, but then to pivot back to that program design for this last bit of our call, I want to talk about host sites, your partnerships and your host sites. One of the important questions to ask is, with your program design, are your AmeriCorps members serving directly at your organization, or are they going to serve at a community placement or a partner site? Those are commonly called host sites. So we have some programs, we've got a program that's doing environmental stewardship work. They all stay with that one program and they all go out as crews and they're only reporting within that program. So that's that first option. They don't have host sites. We then have, for an example, an education site that has members placed at various schools within their district. And that would be that second structure, and those schools are the host sites. So thinking about your structure, are you going to have all of your members serving with you, or are you going to partner with other organizations, agencies, to have them host your members. Beyond that host site piece, some other partners to be considering are fund development. Who and how will you be raising the funds for this program? Are you going to have partners in that? Are you going to seek donations? Do you need to establish partnerships with donors? In a minute, we're going to talk about service projects. Do you have partners where your members can go to serve on projects? And then what about trainers? We see a lot of programs bring in outside trainers to provide some professional development for members. So is establishing partnerships with trainers something that should be worked on? Okay. So if you are going to be using that host site model, as you're thinking through who could be your host site partners, also be thinking about whose role is what. Who is going to be responsible for the recruitment and selection of members? Is that going to be all the host site? Is that going to be all the program? Is that a shared responsibility? How does supervision of members look? What about training of members? Will the member go to the host site and spend their whole time there and host sites be responsible for training? Or will you be pulling members back to your organization once a week or once a month to provide that training? Who is going to be doing the data collection and roll up and reporting? Yeah, whose role is that? How is that going to look? And then being mindful of other overall grant deliverables. How is that distribution of roles and responsibilities going to look like? And then with that, some other things to consider. If you are entering into an agreement with a host site, is there going to be a contract or an MOU? It is kind of a best practice that we would encourage you to do, but is that necessary? What should be in that? Some things to consider. Passing through dollars or vice versa. We have some organizations that, or some programs that partner with an organization and say, okay, here's your member and here's $5,000 to support your member. That is not common. That is not the model we see most often. Most often we see, would you like an AmeriCorps member at your site? Awesome. The fee to have a member at your site is $5,000, and then you can take that and put that into your budget. Training and monitoring your host sites. Like I mentioned, you guys will be the primary grantee, so you need to make sure that if you're placing members at organizations outside of your agency, how are you going to make sure that those host sites are trained and monitored to make sure everything's going the way it's supposed to be going? And then alternative service sites. For our school-based programs, and this is an example, you might think how it could apply, it might not, to your own individual programs, but the example here is our school-based programs where members have to serve 1,700 hours, but the schools have spring break for a week and holiday break or winter break, which is 2 weeks. What do those members do during those breaks? Is there alternative service that those members can be doing during that time? So then some other partners to consider. really want everybody to start thinking about that fund development piece. And that's, there's two ways that that match can look. It can be cash match or in-kind match. For that cash match, that program income, what is the organizational match? Is your matching 24%? Is that just going to be cash from your agency? Are you going to be charging a site fee? And are you going to be matching funds from other sources? The caveat with this, if you're matching with other grants, federal funds cannot be paid or cannot be used to match AmeriCorps unless it is unless you get the other federal entity to approve it. So the actual CFR reads, match is not paid by the federal government under another federal award, except where the federal statute authorizing a program specifically provides that federal funds made available for such program can be applied to matching or cost sharing requirements of other federal programs. That's the actual language. The example here is our school-based programs where the schools get federal funding. Have to get approval to use that federal funding as match for AmeriCorps. Now, Department of Education has done kind of a blanket match that says, yeah, any of our funds can be used to match AmeriCorps funds. But if you're getting your funds from a different federal agency and want to use that as match, you need to get that okay from the other federal agency, not from AmeriCorps. The other type of match, you've got the cash, and the other type is in kind. That can look like site supervisor time. It can look like the space. If you have a desk where your AmeriCorps member sits to do their service, what's the in-kind value of that space? If you're doing a program that requires really specific gear or tools or supplies, and you have a donor who donates those, that can be counted as in kind. And then also meeting refreshments. There are some funky guidelines around using federal funds for food. And so often we see our programs seeking community donations for meeting refreshments. Happy to talk that one over more with you at a later date if anybody has questions around that piece. Another thing I want to mention is, as you're thinking about this fund development, we do have a letter from Serve Washington to support that. It kind of outlines what AmeriCorps is and some of the funding structure, and past programs have used that letter to assist them in some of their fund development efforts. So if you want that, please let me know and I'd be happy to get that for you. Okay, then some other partners you will want to be thinking about. As I mentioned, there are service projects. Every operational program has to select 3 different national service days or events. So the 2 big ones that we focus on at Serve Washington are the September 11th Day of Service and Remembrance and the Martin Luther King Jr. Day of Service. those are the big ones. We really love to see programs participating in those, but not required. If your organization has other kind of events that you take part in, so the United Way Day of Caring, or Make a Difference Day, or Earth Month, whatever applies most to your program, we want to see AmeriCorps members, AmeriCorps programs kind of out in the field, doing some service for the community. So for example, on MLK Day, we have a lot of programs that go to parks or schools or community gardens or food banks to do a project for that day of service. So be thinking through who might be good partners to have those service projects at. We do see some programs that kind of put this on their AmeriCorps members and say, as a professional development piece, we have to do this service project and you all get to plan it. But it's also good to kind of have a couple ideas of partners within your community that might be good places to have a service project. And note that service projects cannot benefit for-profit entities, just like AmeriCorps members can't be serving at for-profit entities. The service projects can't be benefiting them either. And then trainers, I mentioned this earlier, but really consider bringing in outside resources during orientation, during professional development, that sort of thing. When you are thinking through what your orientation and plans are for members, is there a possibility of bringing in some outside trainers? Okay, so your homework, you've kind of touched on with Robin in the past, the first 3 points, but the homework assigned to you today is to start thinking about and identifying host sites, or the process for identifying your host sites, if applicable, if that's going to align with your program design. Identify strategic partners if available, or if applicable, excuse me, and then begin the budget framework. Again, AmeriCorps is not intended to have federal funds fund the whole thing. It is a public-private partnership and goes up to a 50% match requirement if you're here for the long haul, if you're an AmeriCorps program for the long haul. So really thinking through where that matching funds are coming from. Okay, then some of the deliverables, we're really not adding actual deliverables. You know, this quarter, the really big things are what Lou discussed last month: the theory of change, the logic model, the performance measures, and then how are you going to collect the data to report on those performance measures. Those are the big things. We're also going to do a little bit of a lull in homework with this, as kind of that break to focus on the theory of change piece, and before really diving into the member piece. So as you're working on those, please plan to submit them to me and Lou anytime throughout October to get us some general feedback. And you will continue to discuss and assess these throughout your planning grant year. You know, you might make some discoveries as you get deeper into this process. Also, I do know that not everybody has all of their staff on board yet. And if you were waiting to get that staff on board to start with these deliverables, let's touch base in that in our one-on-one calls that I'm going to get established with everybody. And we can talk through that. We can see if there might be flexibility for an extension or what that might look like. Because this curriculum is really designed to be responsive to kind of your needs, what it is that is going to be most helpful for you. So most people, it's going through and developing these deliverables, but some people or some organizations, it looks a little bit different. So let's have that good communication and figure out what works best for you all. So if you are working on those deliverables, there's my email address along with Lou's email address. Yeah, and feel free to send those documents to us anytime through October, or let's discuss it at our one-on-ones. And then I think I went through that really fast because I am done now, about a little over half an hour early. So this would be a good time for any questions that might have come up from anybody.
Yeah, that was a lot of information.
That was a lot of information. And I didn't realize how fast I was going through it all until about halfway through. So my apologies.
No, that's all right. Just thinking. So
I just
about
really appreciate
timelines.
Sorry, Beth. I just appreciate that everything is recorded because I have something to go back and refer to.
Yeah, absolutely. And not only is this recorded, it might take a little bit more poking around on the website, but we still have all of the resources from the last round of planning grants. So the PowerPoint slides are the same, but Robin may have approached it a little bit differently than I did. So if you wanted to go back and look at the one that listen to a recording with a different voice from it that might say different things, you can poke around and find that on our planning grant page somewhere on our website. All right. Well, thank you all so much. I'm really enjoying doing these. And I'm really looking forward to connecting with everybody one-on-one. All right. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I will stay around for a little bit and turn off the recording in case anybody has questions that you want to ask off of the recording.